The howling wind rattled the windows of the stagecoach as Ruby Winters clutched her valise tighter to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. December 1878 was proving to be the cruelest of months in Montana territory, and the promised 2-day journey from Helena to Utica had already stretched to 3 as the snow piled higher with each passing hour. "Ain't never seen a storm blow in this fast," the weathered driver called down through the hatch above. "Miss Winters, I reckon we ought to make for the way station up ahead. Can't risk these horses in this weather much longer." Ruby nodded, though she knew the driver couldn't see her. At 22, this journey represented everything she had worked for a teaching position in Utica that promised independence and a fresh start after her father's passing left her with little more than debts and memories back in St. Louis. The stagecoach lurched violently, nearly sending Ruby into the lap of her fellow passenger, a silver-haired woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Beatrice Holloway when they'd departed Helena. "Sorry to delay your arrival, dear," Mrs. Holloway said, patting Ruby's gloved hand. "But I've lived in these parts nigh on 30 years. When Montana decides to unleash winter's fury, even the bravest souls seek shelter." "I understand," Ruby replied, forcing a smile despite her disappointment. "The school board won't expect me until after Christmas anyway. I simply hope to settle in before the holiday." A particularly vicious gust rocked the coach, and Ruby felt her stomach drop as one of the wheels slipped. The driver's curses mingled with the panicked whinnying of the horses. For several terrifying seconds, Ruby was certain they would overturn, but somehow the skilled driver managed to right their course. "There it is," the driver shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Old Blackwater Way Station ain't much, but it'll keep us alive." Through the frost-covered window, Ruby could make out the dim outline of a large cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. The stagecoach slowed to a halt before the structure, and the driver jumped down to assist his passengers. "Careful now, ladies," he warned, opening the door and extending his hand to Mrs. Holloway. "That wind'll knock you clean off your feet if you ain't steady." Ruby descended last, gasping as the bitter cold stole her breath. The wind tore at her woolen coat and threatened to rip away her hat despite its pins. Head bowed against the assault, she trudged toward the cabin behind Mrs. Holloway and the driver, who carried their luggage. The door to the way station swung open before they reached it, revealing a burly man with a thick beard streaked with gray. "Hurry in," he bellowed over the wind. "Storm's getting worse by the minute." Once inside, Ruby stood trembling in the sudden warmth, snowflakes melting on her eyelashes as she took in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a great room centered around a massive stone fireplace where flames crackled invitingly. Several figures huddled near its warmth, turning to regard the newcomers with varying degrees of interest. Walter McCready, the bearded man, introduced himself, shutting the door firmly against the howling wind. "This here's my way station. Been expecting stragglers since I saw them clouds rolling in this morning." "Jacob Turner," the driver replied, stomping snow from his boots. "Got these ladies bound for Utica, but that blizzard had other ideas." Ruby removed her hat, shaking loose her auburn hair that fell in damp waves past her shoulders. As she did, she became acutely aware of a pair of eyes watching her intently from beside the fireplace. He sat slightly apart from the others, a tall man with broad shoulders and a lean, weather-beaten face. Unlike the others who had gathered close to the flames, he maintained a certain vigilance, his posture suggesting readiness despite his relaxed position in a wooden chair. A gun belt lay across his lap as he methodically cleaned the revolver it contained, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "This here's Miss Ruby Winters," Jacob announced, heading to Utica to be their new schoolteacher, and Mrs. Holloway returning home after visiting her daughter. Ruby nodded politely as Walter McCready began introducing the other occupants of the cabin. There was a middle-aged couple, the Hendersons, who owned a general store in Utica, a traveling salesman named Reginald Parsons, and 2 rough-looking men introduced simply as Dobbs and Cleary, who offered no explanation for their presence or destination. And that there's Isaiah Yates, Walter said, gesturing toward the watchful man by the fire. Came in about an hour before you, just ahead of the storm. Isaiah Yates acknowledged the introduction with a slight nod, his steel blue eyes meeting Ruby's for a brief moment before returning to his task. There was something in that glance, a combination of wariness and intensity that caused Ruby's pulse to quicken. You folks are lucky, Walter continued, moving toward a pot bubbling on a cast iron stove in the corner. Got stew ready and enough bunks for everyone, though it'll be tight quarters tonight. How long do you reckon we'll be stranded? Mrs. Henderson asked, wringing her hands anxiously. Walter shrugged his broad shoulders. Can't say for certain. Storm like this could blow over by morning or last 3 days. Nature don't consult with mankind on her plans, madam. Ruby removed her damp coat and moved toward the fire, seeking its warmth. She was acutely aware of the close quarters and the strangers with whom she would be sharing shelter for an undetermined amount of time. As a single woman traveling alone, she had been cautious throughout her journey, but this situation presented new concerns. First time in Montana territory. The question came from Isaiah Yates, who had finished with his revolver and was now securing it in its holster. Ruby nodded. Is it always this hospitable? She asked, a hint of dry humor in her voice despite her apprehension. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. The weather or the company? Both, I suppose. Weather's honest, at least, Isaiah replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Makes no promises it doesn't intend to keep, as for the company. His eyes drifted briefly to Dobbs and Cleary, who were now helping themselves to Walter's whiskey without asking. Best keep your wits about you, Miss Winters. Before Ruby could respond, Walter called everyone to eat. The stew was hearty, filled with venison and root vegetables, and Ruby found her spirits lifting somewhat as the warm food chased away the last of the chill from her journey. Conversation flowed around the large table tales of past storms, news from distant towns, and speculation about how long they would be confined together. Ruby noticed that Isaiah spoke little, offering only occasional comments when directly addressed. Instead, he watched and listened, his attention seeming to catalog every word and gesture of those around him. As the meal concluded, Walter addressed the sleeping arrangements. Ladies can take the back room, got 3 bunks in there. Men will have to make do out here. Got 2 more bunks in the side room, and the rest can use bedrolls by the fire. Ruby exchanged glances with Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Henderson, relieved they would have some privacy at least. As the evening progressed, most of the party settled around the fire. Mr. Parsons produced a deck of cards, and soon he, Dobbs, Cleary, and Mr. Henderson were engaged in a game of poker. Mrs. Henderson busied herself with some mending she had in her traveling bag, while Mrs. Holloway dozed in a rocking chair. Ruby retrieved a book from her valise, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, and found a quiet corner to read. She was so engrossed that she started when a cup of coffee appeared before her, held by Isaiah Yates. Thought you might want this, he said simply. Night's going to be long and cold. Thank you, Ruby replied, accepting the steaming cup. Do you not care for cards, Mr. Yates? Isaiah settled into a chair nearby, positioning himself where he could observe both Ruby and the card game across the room. I prefer games where skill matters more than luck, he said. And where I can see all the players' hands. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't merely speaking of cards. Ruby studied him more carefully now. His clothing was practical and well-worn, a dark wool coat over a faded blue shirt, denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at the collar, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was a compelling quality to his features, a steadiness in his gaze, and a certain quiet confidence in his bearing. You're not what I expected in a cowboy, Ruby commented, then immediately felt foolish for the observation. Isaiah's eyebrows rose slightly. And what did you expect, Miss Winters? Ruby felt a flush creeping up her neck. I'm not entirely sure. More boisterousness, perhaps. Like in the dime novels. A genuine smile broke across his face then, transforming his serious expression. Those riders have never spent a winter night on the open range with nothing but a thin blanket and the howl of wolves for company, he said. Real cowboys learn to conserve their energy and their words for when they're truly needed. And what brought you to this part of Montana, Mr. Yates? Ruby asked, curious despite herself, his expression sobered. Work, mostly. I'm bringing a herd up from Wyoming to a ranch outside Utica. Got ahead of my men to arrange for winter grazing rights. He paused, taking a sip from his own cup. And you, teaching's a respectable profession, but Montana's a long way from anywhere civilized. Perhaps that's precisely why I chose it, Ruby replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Sint. Louis offered too many memories and too few opportunities. I wanted somewhere I could build something of my own. Isaiah nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. For a moment, Ruby felt as though he could see past her careful words to the truth, beneath the mounting debts after her father's illness, the pitying looks from former friends, the desperate need to escape a city that suddenly felt suffocating. Their conversation was interrupted by a burst of angry voices from the card table. Dobbs had half risen from his seat, face flushed with alcohol and anger. "You've been cheating since the first hand," he accused Parsons, who shrank back in his chair. "I assure you, sir, I have done no such thing," the salesman protested, his voice quavering. "Calling me a liar now," Dobbs growled, his hand drifting toward his waistband. Isaiah was on his feet in an instant, moving with surprising speed for such a large man. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight of authority that stilled the room. "It's just a friendly game, Dobbs. No need for trouble." Dobbs's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he sized up Isaiah. After a tense moment, he snorted derisively and dropped back into his chair. "Ain't worth the bullets," he muttered, though loud enough to be heard. The game resumed with an undercurrent of tension, and Ruby noticed that Isaiah remained standing for several minutes, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. When he finally returned to his seat near Ruby, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said softly. Isaiah shrugged. "Men like that are all bluster until they're not. Better to head it off early." He glanced toward the window, where snow continued to accumulate against the glass. "Storm's getting worse. You should get some rest while you can, Miss Winters." Ruby recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. The day's travel had exhausted her, and the warmth of the cabin combined with her full stomach was making it difficult to keep her eyes open. She gathered her book and nodded to Isaiah. "Good night, Mr. Yates. Sleep well, Miss Winters." Ruby followed Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Henderson to the back room, which contained 3 narrow bunks along one wall. The accommodations were sparse but clean, with quilts that looked handmade. The women prepared for bed in companionable silence, each lost in her own thoughts. As Ruby settled under the heavy quilt, she could still hear the murmur of male voices from the great room, occasionally punctuated by the howl of the wind outside. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. The strange surroundings, the uncertain weather, and the mix of characters with whom she was sheltering all conspired to keep her mind active. She must have dozed eventually, for she awoke with a start some hours later. The cabin was quiet now, save for Mrs. Henderson's gentle snoring and the persistent keening of the wind. Ruby lay still, trying to identify what had awakened her. Then she heard a soft scraping sound, followed by hushed voices just outside the bedroom door. "Sleeping now, easy pickings." The voice belonged to Dobbs. "The schoolmarm's got to have money for setting up in a new place," came Cleary's raspy reply. "And did you see that brooch the old lady was wearing? Pure silver, I'd wager." Ruby's blood ran cold. She slid silently from her bunk, heart pounding as she crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. "What about the cowboy?" Cleary asked. "Been drinking half the night. Probably passed out like the rest of 'em," Dobbs replied with cruel confidence. "We'll be long gone before anyone realizes." Ruby backed away from the door, mind racing. She needed to warn the others, but opening the door would alert Dobbs and Cleary to her wakefulness. Glancing frantically around the small room, her eyes fell on the window. It was small, but she might be able to squeeze through it and circle around to the front of the cabin. Just as she moved toward it, the bedroom door began to open. Ruby froze, expecting to see Dobbs or Cleary, but instead Isaiah Yates slipped silently into the room, a finger raised to his lips in a gesture for silence. "Wake the others," he whispered, barely audible. "Stay in here, bolt the door after me." Before Ruby could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. For a heartbeat, she stood paralyzed with indecision, then sprang into action, shaking Mrs. Holloway and Mrs. Henderson awake as quietly as possible. "What is it, child, Mrs.?" Holloway mumbled, confused by the abrupt awakening. "Trouble," Ruby whispered, explaining in hurried, hushed tones what she had overheard. Mrs. Henderson stifled a cry of fear with her hand, her eyes wide with alarm. "That nice Mr. Yates went out to confront them," Ruby finished, moving to secure the door as he had instructed. "Alone," Mrs. Holloway whispered, clutching her nightgown at her throat. "Against those two brutes," the question hung in the air, unanswered. Ruby pressed her ear to the door again, straining to hear what was happening in the main room of the cabin. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, followed by a thud and a muffled curse. "Going somewhere, gentlemen." Isaiah's voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the door. "Just stepping out for a smoke," Dobbs replied, his tone falsely casual. "With all of Walter's silverware in your pockets." Isaiah's voice remained even. "And I couldn't help but notice you showing particular interest in the ladies' room. Change of plans now that you know I'm awake." There was a tense silence, broken by the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "You should have minded your own business, Cowboy," Cleary growled. What happened next occurred so rapidly that Ruby could only piece it together from the sounds: a scuffle, another thud, a cry of pain, and then the cabin door banging open, letting in a howl of wind and a swirl of snow before slamming shut again. Ruby waited, heart in her throat, until a gentle knock came at the bedroom door. "Miss Winters, it's Isaiah. You can open up now." Ruby slid the bolt and opened the door to find Isaiah standing there, a darkening bruise on his cheekbone but otherwise appearing unharmed. Behind him, Walter McCready and the other men were pulling on coats and boots. "What happened?" Ruby asked, stepping into the main room. "Dobbs pulled a knife," Isaiah explained, touching his cheek gingerly. "I convinced him it was a poor choice. They've taken off into the storm." "You let them go," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, appearing behind Ruby with a shawl clutched around her nightgown. Isaiah shook his head grimly. "They won't get far in this weather without shelter, but Walter and I are going to make sure they don't circle back. Jacob and the others will stay here with you ladies." Ruby caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Be careful," she said softly. "That storm is deadly." Something flickered in Isaiah's eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. He nodded once. "Bolt the door behind us, we won't be long." True to his word, Isaiah and Walter returned within the hour, snow-covered but unharmed. They had followed tracks leading away from the cabin until the storm obscured them completely. "Either they found shelter elsewhere, or they won't be troubling anyone ever again," Walter announced grimly as he hung his coat by the fire to dry. The remainder of the night passed uneventfully, though no one slept much. Isaiah positioned himself in a chair facing the door, his revolver within easy reach. Ruby, unable to return to her bunk, wrapped herself in a blanket and settled in the rocking chair near him. "You should rest," Isaiah told her as the hours crept toward dawn. "So should you," she countered. "Yet here we both are." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Touché, Miss Winters." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the crackling fire and howling wind the only sounds in the cabin. Ruby studied Isaiah's profile in the flickering firelight, noting the alertness in his posture despite the late hour. He had positioned himself where he could observe both the door and the window, his body angled to place himself between any potential threat and the rest of the cabin's occupants. "Why did you stay awake?" Ruby finally asked. "You could have been sleeping like the others when Dobbs and Cleary made their move." Isaiah's gaze remained fixed on the door as he answered. Something wasn't right about those two from the start. Too interested in what everyone was carrying, too quick to anger. I've spent enough time on the trail to recognize the type. "So you sacrificed your night's rest on a suspicion?" Ruby pressed. Now he did look at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I sacrificed nothing of value, Miss Winters." A few hours' sleep is a small price for ensuring the safety of innocent people. The simple sincerity in his words touched Ruby deeply. In a world where her experiences had taught her that most people acted primarily out of self-interest, Isaiah Yates's quiet protectiveness was both surprising and moving. "Well, I am grateful," she said softly. "Not just for myself, but for Mrs. Holloway and the others as well. It's comforting to know there are still men of honor in this world." A faint flush colored Isaiah's cheekbones, visible even in the dim light. "It's nothing more than what any decent man would do," he demurred, clearly uncomfortable with her praise. "I disagree," Ruby said with a small smile. "Decency is rarer than you might think, Mr. Yates. I've found it's worth acknowledging when encountered." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as the night progressed. Ruby's teaching plans for the Utica school, Isaiah's experiences driving cattle across the territories, books they had read, and places they had seen. Despite the circumstances, Ruby found herself enjoying his company immensely. Isaiah was well-spoken for a man who had spent most of his life on the range, with a dry wit that emerged more frequently as they grew comfortable with each other. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the frosted windows, Ruby realized with surprise that they had talked through the remainder of the night. The storm continued unabated outside, snow now piled halfway up the window frames. "Looks like we'll be guests of Walter Macready for another day at least," Isaiah observed, rising to add more wood to the diminishing fire. Walter himself emerged from his small room soon after, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Still coming down, I see," he noted, peering out the window. "Well, might as well make the best of it. Who wants coffee?" The day passed slowly, the cabin's occupants finding various ways to occupy themselves. Mrs. Henderson taught Ruby and Mrs. Holloway a card game called Casino, while the men took turns chopping more firewood from Walter's substantial stockpile. Isaiah disappeared outside for nearly an hour, returning with a pair of rabbits he had somehow managed to snare despite the blizzard. "Man's part mountain lion," Walter commented admiringly as Isaiah prepared the rabbits for cooking. "Never seen anyone track game in weather like this." By late afternoon, the storm showed signs of weakening. The wind decreased from a howl to a moan, and the snow fell less heavily. Walter predicted they might be able to depart by midday tomorrow if the improvement continued. That evening, the mood in the cabin was more relaxed than the previous night. Walter produced a fiddle and played several lively tunes, with Mr. Henderson surprising everyone by revealing a fine singing voice. Even the normally reserved Isaiah seemed to enjoy the impromptu entertainment, his foot tapping in time with the music. Ruby found herself watching him throughout the evening, intrigued by this man of contradictions, capable of violence when necessary yet gentle in his interactions with Mrs. Holloway, silent for long stretches but articulate when he did speak, seemingly detached from the group yet constantly vigilant for their welfare. When the music finally ended and people began preparing for bed, Ruby approached Isaiah, who had once again positioned himself near the door. "Will you actually sleep tonight?" she asked. "The danger seems to have passed." "I'll rest easier than last night," he admitted, "but old habits are hard to break. Years on the trail teach a man to sleep with one eye open." Ruby hesitated, then said impulsively, "I enjoyed our conversation last night, Mr. Yates. I'm almost grateful to the storm for providing the opportunity to make your acquaintance." Something softened in Isaiah's expression. "Likewise, Miss Winters." "Though I might have preferred less dramatic circumstances," Ruby laughed softly. "Where would be the adventure in that?" She grew more serious. "When we reach Utica, would you consider calling on me? I know very little about the town or its people. It would be nice to have one friendly face among strangers." Isaiah regarded her for a long moment, and Ruby feared she had been too forward, but then he nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Once I get my herd settled, I'll be in town regularly." Ruby bid him good night with a lighter heart than she had felt in months. As she settled into her bunk, listening to Mrs. Henderson's gentle snoring and Mrs. Holloway's deeper breathing, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation that had nothing to do with reaching Utica and everything to do with the prospect of seeing more of Isaiah Yates. True to Walter's prediction, the storm had blown itself out by morning. Though the snow lay deep around the cabin, the sky above was a brilliant, clear blue. After a hearty breakfast, preparations began for departure. Jacob Turner examined the stagecoach carefully, declaring it undamaged by the storm and ready to continue the journey to Utica. "Should make town by nightfall if we leave within the hour," he announced as they loaded luggage back onto the coach. Ruby found herself lingering as the others made ready to depart, waiting for a moment to speak with Isaiah privately. He had been busy helping Walter split more firewood as thanks for the shelter, and she had begun to worry they wouldn't have a chance to say a proper goodbye. Her opportunity came as she stood beside the stagecoach, adjusting her hat against the bright winter sun. Isaiah approached, leading a magnificent gray stallion from the stable attached to the way station. "Your mount suits you," Ruby observed as he stopped before her, strong, steady, and undoubtedly smarter than he appears at first glance. Isaiah's mouth quirked in amusement. "Careful, Miss Winters." A man could take that as either compliment or insult, depending on his nature. "And which do you take it as, from you? A compliment, I think." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "I have something for you, not much, but—" He extended his hand, revealing a small carving of a horse, beautifully detailed despite its simplicity. "You made this?" Ruby asked in wonder, taking the carving and running her fingers over the smooth wooden surface. Isaiah nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "Last night while keeping watch." "Helps pass the time." Ruby was touched by the gesture, recognizing the skill and care that had gone into creating the small sculpture. "It's beautiful, thank you. Miss Winters, we're ready to depart," Jacob called from the driver's seat. Ruby tucked the carving carefully into her pocket. "I'll look for you in Utica, Mr. Yates," she said, extending her hand. Instead of shaking it, Isaiah gently turned her hand over and pressed a brief kiss to her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. "Count on it, Miss Winters," he said softly. The journey to Utica passed in a blur for Ruby, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Isaiah Yates. She barely noticed the spectacular winter landscape, the mountains rising majestically against the clear sky, or the small settlements they passed along the way. Mrs. Holloway, seated beside her, observed her distraction with knowing eyes. "That young man made quite an impression on you," she commented as they neared their destination. Ruby felt herself blushing. "He's unlike anyone I've met before." "He's a good man," Mrs. Holloway said with conviction. "You can tell a lot about a person by how they behave when no one is watching, or when they think no one is watching," she amended with a smile. "I woke briefly during the night and saw him standing guard by the door, watching over us all. There's value in a man like that far more than in those who merely talk of honor without living it." Ruby nodded, thinking of Isaiah's quiet vigilance and his matter-of-fact response when danger threatened. There had been no grandstanding, no seeking of praise for his actions. He had simply done what he believed necessary to protect those in his care. Utica, when they finally arrived, proved to be a small but thriving town nestled in a valley between snow-covered mountains. Main Street boasted a handful of substantial buildings, a hotel, a mercantile, a bank, and various other businesses flanked by smaller structures and residences extending outward in a rough grid. A church steeple rose prominently at the north end of town, while a schoolhouse stood at the southern edge. The stagecoach stopped first at the Hendersons' general store, where Ruby bid farewell to the couple who had promised to introduce her around town once she was settled. Next, they delivered Mrs. Holloway to a neat white house with green shutters, where her delighted husband rushed out to greet her despite the cold. "You must come to Sunday dinner once you're settled, dear," Mrs. Holloway insisted as they parted. "And bring that young man of yours when he arrives in town." "He's not my young man," Ruby protested, but Mrs. Holloway merely smiled knowingly. Finally, the coach delivered Ruby to the schoolmaster's residence, a small but tidy cottage adjacent to the schoolhouse. The school board chairman, Mr. Abernathy, was waiting to welcome her, a thin, scholarly man with spectacles perched on his nose. "We're delighted you've arrived safely, Miss Winters," he said, helping her with her luggage. "We were beginning to worry when the storm hit." Please come in out of the cold." The cottage was simple but comfortable, with a parlor, kitchen, and 2 small bedrooms. A fire had been lit in the hearth, and Ruby was touched to see that someone had placed a vase of pine branches on the table, adding a festive touch to the otherwise plain room. "The ladies of the town prepared the house for you," Mr. Abernathy explained, noting her glance at the pine arrangement. "Mrs. Abernathy left some provisions in the kitchen to tide you over until you can shop for yourself. School doesn't resume until after New Year's, so you have time to get acquainted with the town and prepare your lessons." Ruby thanked him sincerely, already feeling welcome in her new community. After Mr. Abernathy departed, she spent the remainder of the evening unpacking her meager belongings and exploring her new home. It was strange to have an entire house to herself after years of boarding with families in St. Louis while teaching, but the independence was exhilarating. As she prepared for bed that night, Ruby took the small wooden horse from her pocket and placed it on the mantel, smiling at the memory of Isaiah's unexpected gift. She wondered how long it would be before he arrived in Utica with his cattle herd, and whether he would truly call on her as promised. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ruby was introduced to what seemed like the entire population of Utica, invited to numerous homes for meals, and given tours of the town by various well-meaning citizens. The schoolhouse needed organizing, and she spent hours arranging books, cleaning slates, and preparing lessons for the 28 students of varying ages who would be in her charge. Christmas came and went, celebrated at the Abernathy's home with many of the town's leading families. Ruby received several small gifts from her new neighbors: a hand-knitted scarf, a jar of preserved peaches, a book of poetry, but found herself checking the road leading into town whenever she ventured outside, hoping to catch sight of a gray stallion and its rider. It was 3 days after Christmas when Ruby, returning from the mercantile with supplies for the coming week, nearly collided with a tall figure exiting the town's only barber shop. "Miss Winters," Isaiah Yates said, his voice carrying a warmth that belied his formal greeting. "I was hoping I'd find you in town." Ruby's heart leapt at the sight of him. He looked different, freshly shaven, his dark hair trimmed neatly, wearing a clean shirt and what appeared to be new denims, but his eyes were the same, crinkling slightly at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Mr. Yates," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her excitement. "You've arrived safely, I see. When did you reach Utica?" "Late last night. Got my men and cattle settled at the Campbell Ranch just outside town." He gestured to her parcels. "Allow me to carry those for you." They walked together toward Ruby's cottage, their conversation flowing easily as though the days of separation had never occurred. Isaiah explained that the journey had been delayed by the aftermath of the blizzard, with deep snow making cattle driving treacherous. "Lost 2 head to the cold," he said grimly. "Could have been worse. Some of the passes were nearly impassable." "But you're here now," Ruby said, glancing up at his profile. "And for how long?" "A while," Isaiah replied. "Mr. Campbell has offered me a position overseeing his ranch operations. It seems his foreman left unexpectedly last month." Ruby couldn't hide her delight at this news. "So you'll be staying in Utica permanently?" "That's the plan," Isaiah confirmed, a certain satisfaction in his tone. 15 years of driving other men's cattle has worn thin. Time to put down some roots. They reached Ruby's cottage and she hesitated at the gate. Propriety dictated that she should not invite a single man into her home without a chaperone, yet she was reluctant to end their conversation so soon. Isaiah solved the dilemma for her. "I wonder, Miss Winters, if you would do me the honor of accompanying me to dinner at the hotel this evening. I understand they serve a decent meal, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation in more comfortable surroundings." "I would like that very much," Ruby replied, a warm flush of pleasure spreading through her despite the winter chill. "Shall I call for you at 6? Ruby nodded, suddenly shy under his steady gaze. "I'll be ready." Isaiah transferred her parcels to her arms, his fingers brushing hers in the process. "Until tonight, then," he said softly, tipping his hat before turning to leave. Ruby watched him go, admiring the straight line of his shoulders and his confident stride. Only when he had disappeared around the corner did she enter her cottage. her mind already racing ahead to the evening. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Utica, with white tablecloths, proper silverware, and a menu that offered more than the standard fare of most frontier establishments. Ruby wore her best dress, a deep green wool with subtle black trim that complemented her auburn hair, and had spent more time than usual arranging her curls into a becoming style. Isaiah arrived promptly at 6, looking so handsome in a dark suit and crisp white shirt that Ruby momentarily lost her composure. He offered his arm with a formal correctness that made her smile, remembering how this same man had faced down armed thieves with unflinching courage. Dinner was a revelation. Away from the tension and constraints of the way station, Isaiah proved to be a thoughtful conversationalist with a breadth of knowledge that surprised her. He had educated himself through years of reading during long cattle drives, devouring any book he could find from dime novels to philosophy. Most cowboys can't read more than their own names, Isaiah explained when Ruby expressed her surprise at his literary knowledge. I was fortunate. My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She made sure I had that foundation before she passed. How old were you when she died? Ruby asked gently. 12. Father did his best, but he wasn't the same after she was gone. By 15, I was working cattle drives to help support the family. Never really stopped until now. As they talked, Ruby found herself sharing more of her own past than she had intended her mother's death when she was young. Her father's decline from a respected attorney to a broken man consumed by grief and eventually illness, and her struggle to make her own way in the world afterward. It must have taken considerable courage to come all this way on your own, Isaiah observed as they lingered over coffee after their meal. Ruby shook her head. Not courage so much as necessity. Teaching positions for women are scarce in St. Louis, and those that exist pay barely enough to survive. When I saw the advertisement for Utica offering both better wages and housing, it seemed like providence. Providence indeed, Isaiah murmured, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. The evening ended too soon for Ruby's liking. Isaiah escorted her home through streets silvered by moonlight on fresh snow, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. At her gate, he paused. Thank you for a most enjoyable evening, Miss Winters, he said formally, though his eyes were warm. I hope we might repeat it soon. I would like that, Ruby replied honestly. He hesitated, then reached out to take her gloved hand in his. Ruby, he said, using her given name for the first time, I find myself thinking of you far more often than is probably wise. I know we've known each other only briefly, but I think of you too, Ruby admitted softly, emboldened by the vulnerability in his expression. More than is proper for a schoolteacher, certainly. A slow smile spread across Isaiah's face. Gently, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles through the glove. Then I'll call on you again, soon. True to his word, Isaiah began calling regularly at Ruby's cottage. Sometimes they walked through town together, sometimes they shared meals at the hotel, and occasionally they simply sat in her parlor in the evenings, reading or talking while a fire crackled in the hearth. Mrs. Abernathy or another respectable matron of the town often served as chaperone during these visits, but there were precious moments of privacy that Ruby treasured. As January gave way to February, Ruby found herself falling deeply in love with Isaiah Yates. It wasn't simply his handsome appearance or his protective nature, though both certainly appealed to her. It was the man beneath the surface, thoughtful, principled, and possessing a quiet strength that came not from physical prowess but from an unshakable moral center. School had resumed after New Year's, and Ruby threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds learning their letters to teenagers studying algebra and Latin. The work was challenging but rewarding, and Ruby found herself happier than she had been in years. Isaiah sometimes met her after school ended, walking her home or bringing small gifts, a book he thought she would enjoy, wildflowers he had found on an early spring day, once even a kitten he had rescued from an abandoned farmstead, which Ruby promptly named Shakespeare and which took up residence in her cottage. The town noticed their courtship, of course. Utica was too small for any relationship to escape observation, particularly one involving the new schoolteacher and the handsome ranch foreman who had so quickly become respected figures in the community. Ruby occasionally overheard whispered speculations about when Isaiah might propose, but she tried not to let such talk pressure or influence their developing relationship. One crisp March evening, Isaiah invited Ruby for a ride outside town. The snow had mostly melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring, and the air held the promise of warmer days to come. Isaiah brought a gentle mare for Ruby to ride alongside his gray stallion. They rode out past the town limits, following a winding creek that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Neither spoke much, content to enjoy the beauty of the Montana landscape and each other's company. Finally, they stopped at a small rise overlooking a meadow where early wildflowers had begun to bloom. Isaiah helped Ruby dismount, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. He seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, as he secured the horses to a nearby tree. "It's beautiful here," Ruby commented, breathing deeply of the fresh air. "So peaceful." Isaiah nodded, moving to stand beside her. "I discovered this spot my first week at the Campbell Ranch. Reminded me of a place my mother used to take me as a boy." He hesitated, then continued. "I've been thinking about the future, Ruby." Her heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone. "Oh, Mr. Campbell has offered me a partnership in his ranch. He has no sons and his health isn't what it was. He believes I could take over the operation entirely in a few years." Isaiah turned to face her fully. "It's more than I ever expected a chance to build something lasting, something of my own." "Isaiah, that's wonderful," Ruby exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "The thing is," he continued, taking her hands in his, "I don't want to build that future alone." He took a deep breath. "These past months, getting to know you, have been the happiest of my life. You're everything I never knew I was looking for: strong, kind, intelligent, and braver than any woman I've ever met." Ruby's breath caught as Isaiah released her hands only to reach into his pocket. From it, he withdrew a small wooden box. "I carved this too," he said with a small smile, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful gold ring set with a small pearl, though the contents are from the jeweler in Helena. Dropping to one knee before her, Isaiah looked up at Ruby with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. "Ruby Winters, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I can't promise you a life of luxury, but I swear to you that I will spend every day striving to be worthy of your love." Ruby's heart felt as though it might burst with joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Isaiah, yes." His face transformed with a brilliant smile as he rose to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then, finally, his lips met hers in their first kiss, gentle at first, then deepening with the emotion they had both held in check for so long. When they eventually broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Ruby Winters," he said softly. "Have since that first night at the way station when you sat reading Shakespeare by firelight while a blizzard raged outside." "And I love you, Isaiah Yates," Ruby replied, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "My vigilant protector who gave up a night's sleep to keep me safe among strangers." "Best night of lost sleep I ever experienced," Isaiah murmured, pulling her close again. They remained in the meadow until the sun began to set, talking of their future together: the ranch they would build, the home they would share, the family they hoped to create. As they rode back to Utica in the gathering dusk, Ruby felt a sense of rightness, as though all the hardships and sorrows of her past had been leading her to this moment, to this man. News of their engagement spread quickly through Utica. The school board, after initial concern about losing their teacher, agreed that Ruby could continue teaching until the end of the term in June, after which the wedding would take place. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting an engagement dinner, where Ruby and Isaiah were toasted by what seemed like the entire town. "I knew it from the moment I saw you two together at the way station," Mrs. Holloway confided to Ruby during the celebration. "The way he watched over you, and the way you looked at him when you thought no one was noticing. Some connections are simply meant to be." Spring progressed into early summer, the days growing longer and warmer as Ruby's students prepared for end-of-term examinations, and she made plans for her wedding. Isaiah was busy at the ranch, overseeing the spring calving and training new hands, but he still found time to call on Ruby several evenings each week. Together, they selected a piece of land that was part of the Campbell Ranch, a lovely spot not far from the meadow where Isaiah had proposed, with a view of the mountains and the creek running nearby. There they would build their home, a modest but comfortable dwelling that would grow as their family did. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the first Saturday in July 1879. The ceremony was held in Utica's white clapboard church, filled to capacity with townspeople and ranchers from the surrounding area. Mr. Abernathy gave the bride away, and Mrs. Holloway served as matron of honor. Mr. Campbell stood proudly as Isaiah's best man. Ruby wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her select from a catalog, adorned with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadow that had become their special place. But her most treasured accessory was the delicate gold chain around her neck, from which hung Isaiah's carved wooden horse, now set in a small gold frame, his wedding gift to her, a reminder of where their journey together had begun. Isaiah, waiting at the altar, thought he had never seen anything more beautiful than Ruby walking toward him, her face radiant with happiness. The memory of that first night at the way station when he had stayed awake watching over her, drawn to her courage and grace, even then seemed both distant and immediate. How fortunate he had been that a blizzard had forced them together, giving him the chance to meet the woman who would change his life. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Isaiah's strong voice carried clearly through the church as he promised to love, honor, and protect Ruby for all the days of his life. Ruby's response was equally firm and clear, her eyes never leaving his as she pledged herself to him. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. As the summer twilight finally fell, the newlyweds slipped away to the small cabin Isaiah had prepared for them on their land, a temporary home, while their permanent house was being built. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," Isaiah said softly as he carried Ruby across the threshold. The cabin was simple but charming, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, and a comfortable bed covered with a colorful quilt made by the women of Utica as a wedding gift. Candles glowed warmly on the mantel, and a vase of wildflowers stood on the table. "It's perfect," Ruby said, taking in the evidence of Isaiah's careful preparation. "Our first home together." Later, as they lay in each other's arms, the candles burned low and moonlight streamed through the small window. Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young woman fleeing painful memories in St. Louis to the beloved wife of a man she respected and adored, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. "What are you thinking?" Isaiah asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That sometimes the worst storms lead us to the safest harbors," Ruby replied, nestling closer to him, "if not for that blizzard." "I would have found you anyway," Isaiah said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be." Ruby Yates. The years that followed proved Isaiah right. Their partnership flourished, both in love and in their shared endeavors. The house they built became known throughout the region for its warmth and hospitality. Ruby continued to teach, first in the Utica school, and later, when their children began to arrive, from their own home, taking in students from outlying ranches who needed education during the winter months. Isaiah's partnership with Mr. Campbell prospered, eventually becoming the Yates Ranch when the older man retired and sold his remaining interest to them. Under Isaiah's management, it became one of the most successful operations in the territory, known for the quality of its cattle and horses and for the fair treatment of its workers. Their first child, a son they named James William after both their fathers, arrived a year after their wedding, a sturdy boy with Isaiah's dark hair and Ruby's intelligent eyes. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and eventually a second son, Robert, completed their family. Through the years, Ruby never forgot the night that had brought them together. The small wooden horse remained one of her most treasured possessions, displayed prominently on the mantel of their home. And every December, on the anniversary of the blizzard that had stranded them at Walter McCready's way station, Isaiah and Ruby would share a private toast by the fire, remembering the night a cowboy had stayed awake protecting a schoolteacher among strangers, setting them both on a path neither had anticipated but neither would change. On their 25th wedding anniversary, with their children grown and the first grandchild on the way, Isaiah surprised Ruby with a journey back to the way station where they had met. Walter McCready had long since passed away, but his son had maintained the place, still offering shelter to travelers on the road between Helena and Utica. "It seems smaller than I remember," Ruby commented as they stood in the great room where they had first spoken, where Isaiah had stood guard through the night. "Some things haven't changed, though," Isaiah replied, pulling her into his arms. His hair was streaked with silver now, and lines of experience marked his face, but his eyes still held the same steady warmth when he looked at her. "What things?" Ruby asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'd still stay awake all night to protect you," he said simply. "I'd still notice you above everyone else in any room. I'd still choose you every day for all the days I have." Ruby reached up to touch his beloved face, thinking of all they had built together, their ranch, their family, their life of purpose and love. "And I'd still walk into a blizzard if I knew you were waiting on the other side," she whispered. Outside, snow began to fall softly, but within the way station, Ruby and Isaiah were warm in each other's embrace, grateful for the storm that had once forced them together and for all the days of sunshine that had followed.